Podcast. I am here with my co-host, as always, just me. And we are joined today by special guest Kevork Almassian from Syriana Analysis, here to talk with us today about events going on in Syria and the how it transpires or how it relates to the war in Ukraine. Kevork, hello, how are you?
Hello, thank you very much for having me. I'm good. How are you doing?
Good. JM, how are you today?
Well, we meet on a very inauspicious day, but then again, that is why we study geopolitics.
So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, Kevork? I know you're Armenian, yes, and you have a very strong interest in Syria.
Yes, I'm ethnic Armenian. I was born in Syria in 1987. My grandparents were survivors of the Armenian genocide. So when they flew the genocide, they arrived in Aleppo around 1915. And since then, my ancestors, or let's say my grandparents and my parents, they live in Syria, in Aleppo. We were settled there. And we grew up in a political environment because the grandparents used to tell us a lot about the genocide and how it happened and the atrocities committed against the Armenians. So I was more or less, let's say, grew up in a politicized environment. And but the events in the Middle East always impose on you more interests because it's non-stop, especially after I was born. That was the Second Gulf War. And then we had the invasions of Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Gaza Strip, and then Libya, and finally in Syria. So it's just non-stop political events, I would say, that grew a big interest in me as well in politics. In 2010, sorry, in 2005, when I finished my 12th degree, or the baccalaureate, we say it in Syrian, I chose to study international relations and diplomacy because of everything was happening in the region. And I wanted to be involved more and understand more how international politics work. And I studied in Syria for 4 years, and my university sent me 1 year to Paris for an exchange program. I also studied there the European affairs, or the EU. And finally, I did my master in political science in Lebanon. Yeah, I mean, university studies were very important to understand the basics or the foundations of geopolitics and what these countries are struggling for when it comes to bigger wars, such as in Syria and in Ukraine. But I would say 90% of my knowledge in geopolitics came from the practical involvement in politics, or reading day-to-day events in different parts of the world and trying to correlate between them and just draw dots over the letters, and after following at least the wars in closely, let's say Libya, Syria, and Ukraine, I found really great similarities between these three wars in terms of how the media portrays these wars and how these wars were sold to the public as legitimate wars. And what is our role as people who wish that less wars would happen in the world, because people who do not who didn't leave war, they do not know what the type of trauma can wars inflict on millions of people and generation after generation. So my main purpose now in political activity is to show the people the truth of these wars, the reality why these big parties are fighting these wars, so that we can avoid it in the future. Because if we don't learn it from history, we shall repeat it in the future.
Yeah, and I think that is a good way to segue us into the events of 2011. So in the West, they're called the Arab Spring, and it was portrayed as a pro-democracy uprising of people wanting rights and greater expression. I think as people now have had a chance 12 years on after the events, and doesn't that make us all sound so old, to see that it was more complicated. But could you walk us through more of what was going on and why that narrative that is still out there in the West is, shall we say, oversimplified.
Mhm. Actually, we don't have, let's say, concrete evidence whether the Arab Spring was engineered from Washington or not, but we do know that the outcomes of these uprisings, or call it whatever you want, was the main outcomes were the rise of regressive groups to power, and they are definitely not undemocratic. For example, in Tunisia, the group of Ghannouchi, and they are Muslim Brotherhood, they reached to power. And after that, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood reached to power. In Libya, half the country is in the hands of the Islamists again. In Syria, the main fighting happened by the Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood factions underground. So whether this was engineered or not from the outside, that's irrelevant. What is really relevant is how this Arab Spring uprisings served the interests of the United States in the region, because there was apparently under Obama and Clinton administration, there was an intention to support these Islamists in the region, and especially exactly the opposite, to achieve exactly the opposite of what they preach. Because in the region, we started to see a certain level of stability, and the people were, due to the globalized flow of information, people were more educated, people were more becoming intellectual, and the economies started to boom. For example, in Syria, we had a very good functioning economy, and the GDP was growing vastly during at least between 2005 and 2010. And when the economies grow, it also reflects on the livelihood of the people, the quality of the life, and it also reflects on politics. So in my opinion, when the Americans, whether they engineered it or not, or whether they later jumped in the wagon of this Arab Spring, by supporting these regressive groups, they just pushed the entire area into decades behind. And especially in Syria, where I come from, everything that they preached about Syria, that we're supporting moderate groups, we're supporting democratic groups, those were just on TVs. On TV, you see people wearing ties and wearing nice suits and talking nice things. And they're well trained by NGOs and well trained by American funded organizations. But on the ground, who's doing the fighting? If the groups that fight against the government in Syria is 99% are saying that we consider democracy is against the rule of God and we have to raise the flag of the Sharia in Syria, etc., then those who will win on Assad on the ground, those are the ones who will set up the future of Syria. So I think it was a big psyop, a big conspiracy, and I'm not saying it as just an emotional statement. It was a big conspiracy against the people of the region to push them back through these regressive groups. And now in Syria, if you compare Syria in 2010 and 2023, in 2010, we were way more developed economically, socially, intellectually, education-wise, health sector. I was just rewatching one of my interviews with Alena Duhan. She's Dr. Alena Duhan. She is the UN Special Rapporteur on the impact of the unilateral coercive measures, the sanctions on Syria. And she mentioned the health sector, and she said the health sector in Syria was one of the best in the entire Middle East before the war. And we had the best health sector in terms of free healthcare, medication, and also severe diseases such as cancer treatment. And now in Syria, if someone suspects that has cancer, the checkup process could take up to 6 months, which means if this person has a cancer, if it's stage 1, it is stage 2, or if it's stage 2, it becomes stage 3. So they are dying, the people, because of the lack of the medical centers, because the hospitals were destroyed. And let's be honest, the biggest cancer treatment hospital in the Middle East, entire Middle East, was in Aleppo, and it was called Al-Kindi Hospital. And the Turkish and NATO-backed terrorists, they blew it up completely in 2014, and they executed all the guards of the hospital, and they destroyed the entire hospital. And this hospital was treating Syrians and non-Syrians for free, and we're talking about cancer treatment. So now Syria, if we need medication for cancer treatment, and we cannot import the materials needed for manufacturing this medicine because of the sanctions. And the sanctions, they say they are not targeted. They're not targeting against the health sector, and this is not correct, because when you sanction the central bank and you ban transactions, that means you aren't able to pay for the materials you need to buy these substances to build the medicine. And secondly, because of the sanctions on the energy sector and the theft of the Syrian oil by the American occupation forces, you aren't able to generate electricity, and the government prioritizes the hospitals for 11 to 12 hours per day. The rest of the day, so half the day, they have to generate electricity from generators. So they have from the black market, they have to buy fuel to generate electricity. So it's a really difficult situation in Syria. I think what the Western governments did to Syria is a crime against humanity, and unfortunately, it is presented in a basket of humanity, and telling us, no, we are helping the Syrian people, and we are giving them all the aid or the help they need to build their democracy, etc., etc. I will just give you a very simple example about it. The Americans say, for example, we are the biggest humanitarian donor to the Syrians. And if you calculate it financially, you will see what they say is correct. But when you see practically, you realize that all this American aid, all the American aid is going to Al-Qaeda held areas. 90% of the territories where the people live in Syria, not a penny is going to these areas, but rather to the areas controlled by Al-Qaeda. Secondly, we know that under Trump, for example, the U.S. Army started burning with the balloons. It's called the burning balloons. They burned the wheat in Syria, in the eastern shore of the Euphrates, and the wheat in Syria is the best in the world. And I'm not saying this because I'm Syrian. Wheat is in Syria because of the richness of the soil is the best in the world. And the Syrian, there is a Syrian institution called ICARDA. They developed the genetic codes of wheat, which is very much resistant against bugs and any sorts of insects that could eat this wheat. So our wheat was very resistant against these bugs. So what the Americans did basically in 2013, when this so-called Free Syrian Army, funded by the CIA, they occupied Aleppo, or half of Aleppo and the suburbs. They occupied this center, this institution, and they stole the genetic codes of this wheat, and they sent it to the United States. And in the United States, they had a really real problem, severe problem with growing up wheat, and because the bugs were really damaging the wheat, and they solved this problem in the United States by stealing the genetic codes from Syria. Whereas the US aid, which is a CIA franchise of an NGO, they sent genetically modified wheat seeds to the farmers in eastern Syria, where it's outside of the control of the government, where the most of the Syrian wheat is. And they distributed it to the Syrian people as a gift. And they posted it proudly, and they said, we're helping the Syrian people. But when you do very simple research, and because the Syrian side has its own miners, right, also on the eastern shore of the Euphrates, they got access to some of these seeds, and they brought it to the government areas. And when they studied it turned out that those are genetically modified wheat seeds. So they're basically damaging the agriculture of Syria under the auspices of, well, no, we are helping the Syrian people.
I think that is certainly something that is very fascinating. Not to take the subject to Ukraine, because we have a lot more to discuss with Syria, but it's of interest to note, I think, for our listeners, that during the negotiations on the EU accession agreement that Yanukovych was mulling signing in 2013, one of the requirements was that Ukraine be willing to accept in its agricultural sector genetically modified seeds, and
Yes.
Yanukovych did not want to accept that.
Yes.
So that's another interesting point.
Which makes you question, what's the intention of ruining because we know the best wheat in the world is in Syria and in Ukraine. And it makes you question what's the intention on a global scale when you are promoting genetically modified wheat, which is a type of food that most people like to eat. So what's the intention on a human level, on an international level, when you are promoting this type of food? Is it in the interest of the people, or is it against the interest of the people? Which one is more preferable from a medical point of view? So it's crazy when you see the intention is to probably in the next generations to poison the people, to decrease the age rate of the people. Why? There is always this talk about oh, we are overpopulated, and those are the ones, the elites, the global elites, they keep repeating this. Oh no, we are overpopulated, which is untrue. We are not overpopulated on this universe. So what is the intention behind pushing this type of food on the people? And now you go to supermarket and try to just check uh, on the back of the food, the processed food that they sell in the market, what kind of materials they're adding to preserve this food. And most of it is very poisonous to humans. So when you target the food of the people, you are also targeting their health, and they're targeting their productivity and targeting their lives.
Obviously, of course, the civil war in Syria now has been raging for 12 years. And while the world's attention, or at least many people's attention, has been turned to what's going on in Ukraine, obviously what's happening in Syria has not stopped. Could you tell us about what developments there have been in Syria for the past year?
Mhm. Actually, things started to change in Syria after the liberation of Aleppo 2016. This was the biggest, I would say, military victory for the Syrian army and its allies. Then came the Ghouta, the surroundings of Damascus were liberated. Since then, the regime change camp in the region, and I mean Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and other regional countries, they realized the regime change war is over, because also Trump stopped the funding of these so-called rebels. He stopped the CIA covert program called Timber Sycamore, which was one of the costliest covert operation in the history of the agency of the CIA. So all of a sudden, when Trump stopped the funding, all these so-called rebel groups started to be crumbled, and they lost most of their battles. And since 2018, some countries in the region started to reopen ties with Syria, such as the UAE, Egypt, Bahrain. Other countries, such as Saudi Arabia, was more hesitant. They asked the Russians to mediate between Syria and the Saudi Arabia, because they want some guarantees from Syria in terms of the Iranian presence in Syria. The Turkish side also understood that the game has been backfired. Now they have over 3.5 million Syrian refugees. On top of that, a huge inflation and economic problem. So when you have such a problem, the easiest thing to do is to blame the other. And the others are in Turkey are the refugees from their perspective. So they really want to force the refugees to go back to Syria, but this is not going to happen unless they deal with Syrian official state. So what's happening now is Russia is mediating between Turkey and Syria, and I think the talks are advanced, and there will be soon a meeting between the foreign ministers of Turkey and Syria, Çavuşoğlu and Mekdad. And after the elections, I think if Erdogan wins the elections, there will be preparations for a meeting between Assad and Erdogan. And this is the ugly reality in politics, that leaders have to meet each other, despite the fact that they were one day arch enemies, and Erdogan wanted to overthrow Assad, and he invested so much in Syria. But the tide has turned thanks to the Syrian army, the Russian forces, Iran, Hezbollah, all these parties which help Syria to break this regime change war, or to defeat this regime change war project in Syria. Now we see the Arab diplomats and Arab officials are flying every day to Damascus from Lebanon, from Bahrain, from Egypt, from the UAE. Many regional countries are sending their diplomats to Syria to meet with Assad to open ties. I think the United States isn't very happy about it, and that is why 3-4 days ago they issued another statement in the Congress, voted almost unanimously. Like only 2 members of Congress they vetoed it or voted against, and it criminalizes normalizing relations with the Syrian government. And I mean, the Americans also, on the other hand, they are losing their grip over the Middle East. So especially after the Ukraine war, many countries in the region, especially the UAE and Saudi Arabia, they understood that there is an alternative. For many decades, they were mostly embedded with the United States because they thought this is the only superpower and nobody can challenge this superpower, so they wanted to be protected by the superpower. But now these countries see that there is an alternative in the East, and it is Russia and China. And that's why you see increased relations, improvement of relations between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, with China and Russia. And the Saudis apparently they abandoned this their exporting of Wahhabism to the region in the Middle East, in Central Asia, which was a role tasked to the Saudis by the United States. So these are positive news, in my opinion, in the region. If the Saudis and the Iranians get along and they sit on a table and they negotiate on the bringing stability to the region, I think that would have a really big impact on the entire region, especially that the United States finds itself in a position that it has to prioritize its conflict, because the existential conflict for the United States is in Ukraine and it's in Taiwan. It's not in the Middle East. Syria was a battlefield on the chessboard, but the bigger conflict, or what determines the future of the international system, is not now in Syria. They lost in Syria, and this was it definitely will have an impact on how we organize the international system in the future. But the main battlefield is in Ukraine. And China understands this. And China knows if Russia loses Ukraine or NATO wins Ukraine, its turn is coming. So increasingly, I haven't seen in the history China and Russia are getting along this much. Like I don't remember in the history if there was any time that Russia and China were this close together, and that's because of the American policies. And the Americans, they feel that the grip over the world, they cannot keep it the way it is. So when an empire feels that their powers are diminishing, they start usually to overreact and overreact militarily. And this is the case in Ukraine. This is going to be the nail in the coffin of the American empire. I'm not saying the Americans will become a small country, but they will not be able to rule the world unanimously or unilaterally in this regard. They will definitely be challenged by increased Russian and Chinese influence. And that could be interpreted in 2 ways. One way, people say multipolarity is good news for the people. Yes, it's good news for us as people who were for a very long time under the American hegemony, living under American hegemony and wars. But on the other hand, increased challenging of the Americans will definitely lead to more wars, because the Americans or the ruling elite in the United States isn't ready to give up their powers now to the rest of the world or to the other peoples. And these people, like, I've been following them since at least the second Gulf War and the sanctions on Iraq, murdering 500,000 children, and now murdering 500,000 people in Syria with this regime change war. So I truly believe that they're psychopaths, and they see us as flies, and they don't care about the value of a human being when it comes to their hegemonic status. So I truly believe that they are not going to give up, and they're gonna escalate in Ukraine. And we have to promote for the true narrative, and that is Ukraine is not gonna win this war. Those who say Ukraine is gonna win this war and we're gonna support Ukraine as long as it takes, they are pushing us to the verge, on the verge of a nuclear war. Because those who say that Ukraine will win this war, meaning that Ukraine will capture the Donbass, Mariupol, and the peninsula again. And we all know what does that mean. And if that means that Ukraine are gonna capture these areas again, it's World War III. It's gonna be nuclear war, because Russia's existence also depends on this war. So those were the ones pushing us on the verge of nuclear weapon, nuclear attack, or nuclear Armageddon are the ones promoting this false and unrealistic narrative. Ukraine is going to win this war, and it's not true. Ukraine cannot win this war were it not for the 150 billion aid to Ukraine by the NATO countries. Ukraine would have lost this war in a matter of weeks. So this is a proxy war between NATO and Russia, and I think we are really living in dangerous times, and there is a big nervousness, I would say, among the political elites in the West, and brutalism in terms of even dealing with their allies. Like if the United States is blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipelines, which belongs to its ally, Germany, then imagine what could they do in order to preserve their hegemonic status when it comes to its conflict with China and Russia. If they're doing it with their allies, then what would they do with their enemies?
So generally speaking, I know Syrians have been through so much and probably don't even have time to think, especially given the events with the recent earthquake and stuff. But is there any general feeling about the conflict in Ukraine in regards to what a possible Russian victory means for Syria on a global scale?
Actually, I follow the people's reactions, especially on social media. It's not 100% indicator, but you can see I have a. It's not like a hobby, but I like to see what the people comment, right? When there is a big Syrian page, for example, and they post about the Ukraine war. So I go through the comments to see what the people say. And I would say there is a division among the Syrian people. Some people are truly, they don't care because for them, the priority is uh, to buy bread and milk for their children. You know, they are very busy in day-to-day basic necessities, securing these basic necessities. On the other hand, those who are probably more aware of the international these dynamics, they see truly that this war in Ukraine is also going to determine the outcome of the Syrian war. Because let's remember, the US still has occupation forces in Syria, and they occupy 1/3 of the country. They occupy the oil fields and the wheat fields, and also they occupy in southern Syria a border crossing, in Al-Tanaf border crossing, in order to block Syria's access to its neighbors. And they believe if the US power stays the same or it doesn't diminish, there is no chance for Syria to capture these territories. And the Americans do not have let's say, a long-term future in Syria. They will withdraw one day or another. But there is a big difference between agreeing with the United States and asking it to leave in exchange for compromises from the Syrian side, compared to a withdrawal of the Americans if they are defeated. If they are defeated, you're not going to compromise with the Americans. But if they're not defeated, then you have to give something back to the Americans. You have to change a behavior, you have to change a foreign policy here or there in Lebanon or in Palestine, for example. And in my humble opinion, I studied the Syrian foreign policy in the civil war in Lebanon. It was a very long civil war in Lebanon, and Syrians always bet on a long-term change of conditions. and they always think that things cannot stay the same in politics. So if it's not in your favor now, it could be in your favor in 10 years. But in Lebanon, the case was Syrian army was fighting on a Lebanese territory against the United States, against the allies of the United States, and against Israel and the allies of Israel. But since 2005, because Syrian army withdrew from Lebanon, the battlefield has changed, and it's no more in Lebanon. The fight there has become political, but the real hot, let's say, war has become in Syria. So also betting on a long-term change of international dynamics also doesn't really serve the interests of the people. So it's true that geopolitically Syria can gain some gains on a longer term. But what about 500,000 people died in Syria, right? Because this conflict is on your territory. So I think whatever the Syrian people think about the Ukraine war, the truth that we cannot ignore is that if the United States loses its grip over Ukraine, it will eventually lead to diminished American hegemony over Eurasia. And whoever controls Eurasia controls the world. So if the US hegemony diminishes over Eurasia, it will definitely diminish over the world. And this is a good news for the Syrians. And to be honest with you, I am one of the people that believe that the US empire has expanded so much. It was an overexpansion, and now is the time to for this empire to decrease its expansion. And this will definitely reflect positively on the Syrian people who live now under harsh American sanctions. If the international monetary system, the financial system that the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians and the Indians are working together now, if this changes, all these sanctions will be worthless. Let them sanction. But up until this moment, since the dollar is the main global currency, and it is linked to the oil, linked to the gold, and the IMF, the World Bank, everything in the world is related now to the dollar, right? If this changes, which will happen, it's just a matter of when, only then the people in Syria will be able to breathe again and recover again. But before that, if you expect the Americans to allow Syria to breathe again, these people are really in a big illusion.
I think then that something that our listeners might be interested in is that in the fall of 2015, the Russian military openly invaded. Well, I'm sorry, that's the wrong word to use, because they were invited by the legitimate government in Damascus to come and assist. So could you walk us through how that changed the dynamics of the civil war when the Russian Expeditionary Force arrived? Because you mentioned the Battle of Aleppo, but I have to say, speaking for myself, that when the Russians first turned up, I thought it would be much like, well, if any other power had turned up, because we'd seen what had happened with the French intervention in Mali and also various US interventions, but it's clear that the Russian intervention had quite a bit more success. Could you tell us how things changed in general? Like, what did people think, and also how the fighting changed after they had showed up?
So first, the Syrian government invited Iranian advisors and Hezbollah fighters in 2012. And it was quite clear that this was over the capacity of Syrian army, Hezbollah, and Iranian, let's say, affiliated groups in Syria. And because the Iranian and the Hezbollah are Shiites, and the majority in Syria, even from the pro-government camp, are Sunnis, there is always this sensitivity that these forces are Shiites and not Sunni. But the Russians were accepted among the pro-government people from different ethnicities, sects, religions, etc. Any foreign power, the legitimacy of any foreign power in Syria or anywhere else depends on few conditions, factors. One is the invitation of the legitimate government. Now, you would argue that if the Assad government is legitimate or not. If you're opposition, you would say it's not legitimate, but the Syrian government is the one represented in the UN, so it has the legal capacity to invite foreign powers. Unless you remove Assad from power and you form a new government, then you cannot argue on a legal basis that this government is not legitimate. So the legitimate government invited the Russian forces to Syria officially. Secondly, the Russian forces in Syria, on a popular level, they are accepted. They don't see the Russian forces as invader. They don't see the Russian forces as a force that is there against the will of the people. And most importantly is the behavior of the Russian forces. For example, when you see a Russian soldier walking in the street after his service, going to eat in a sandwich or sitting in a restaurant, those are small details that are really important. You would see that the people are smiling to the faces of the Russian soldier. They're trying to socialize with him. So those are really important factors for the success of the Russian forces in Syria. But above all, the air force of the Russian forces were very effective against the American-backed terrorists, because the Syrian Army Air Force, they have the MiG-21 and the MiG-29 and some of the Sukhois, but the rebels were supplied by American Iglas, American shoulder-carried anti-air defense systems, and they were really successful in gunning down lots of Syrian planes. But when the Russian forces intervene, although they gunned down a few, but the repercussions for that is big, because you as a United States, you are supplying weapons to people that are gunning down air fighter jets belong to another superpower. So the calculations changed. The Americans were worried of a huge escalation with Russia, so they diminished or decreased the supply of such weapons to the so-called rebels. The Russians helped the ground forces in Syria a lot. When you have an aerial cover, your advance on the ground will be more efficient. But we have to remember, the Air Force itself cannot win a battle. The Air Force can pave the way for the ground forces. So were it not for the very skilled fighters that were trained after the war on guerrilla warfare, street fights, and this belonged to the Syrian army, the Hezbollah forces, and other militias, those are the ones who liberated on the ground. Those are the ones who carrying the fight. But so the both sides, this cooperation between them was very successful. There was some, of course, let's say, miscommunication or some different interests by different sides. But overall, it was very successful because first, the presence was legitimate. Secondly, because it was accepted among the people. And thirdly, because the ground forces were effective against the enemies on the ground. And the enemy doesn't have an air force. The rebels do not have an air force. So it is a lose battle for them. They cannot win this war. That's why the American side changed the tactic into a fourth generation of asymmetrical warfare, which is it's a type of a warfare that one side is stronger than the other side, but the stronger side cannot achieve a decisive victory over the weaker side. So you just give the amount of weapon and supply of ammunition to the enemy side, to the terrorist side, in a way that they can just continue fighting. They cannot advance. They cannot win this war, but just the war continues. So this was the plan of the Americans. They supplied enough weapons to these so-called rebels, and also Israel in the south. They also supplied the rebels with medical supplies. They supplied them with money. However, now we are in 2023. We can see that these groups have no chance at all against the government anymore. The priority is in Idlib. The Idlib is the largest safe haven for al-Qaeda terrorists in the world, and this is the evaluation of the Pentagon, not mine. It has to be solved through negotiations with Turkey. if Turkey opens the M4 highway for the Syrian side, I think pushing the terrorists 10 to 20 kilometers to the northwest of the highway to the borders with Turkey would be a big success, because on the long term, when they see that there is no supply of weapons, there is no logistic support to them, they will either try to reintegrate into society if they're Syrians, or to escape the country if they are, let's say, foreigners. Because in Idlib, we have lots of foreigners. We have at least 5,000 Uyghurs from Xinjiang, from China, with their families. They are at least 15,000 people, and they are multiplying like rabbits there. And we have Tajikis, we have Saudis, Egyptians, from Chechnya. We have lots of multinational jihadists there, which we have to solve this diplomatically, because war is not always the solution for such type of conflicts. Yes, we want to take revenge from these terrorists, but at the end, the reason or the logic says that waging a war against these very skilled and hardcore jihadists will definitely lead into thousands and thousands of dead people among the civilians who are stuck in Idlib. And let's remember, these jihadists do not have headquarters like military camps or positions that you can see their badges or their uniform. No, they're just living among the cities and among the towns. And sorry to say, they are wearing their flip-flops fighting. So you can't really differentiate between a fighter and a civilian. And when they are, for example, firing missiles from a residential area, and it is truly targeting, for example, the city of Latakia, and when you come as an air force and bomb that area, civilians will die. So it's better to this conflict to be solved in diplomatic way with Turkey. Try to absorb whatever you can absorb, try to reintegrate whoever wants to reintegrate again into the society, and the multinational jihadists have to be solved in talks between Turkey and Syria, and Turkey has to deliver these messages to the countries of the origin of these multinational jihadists.
So, if anybody knows me, even like in the slightest, they know that I am the biggest fan of Bashar. I love Bashar. I've always loved Bashar. I actually just did a video presentation on why Western media will not portray Bashar in even remotely an accurate way. But since you are so in tune with Syria and the Syrian people, I wanted to know maybe more about their sentiments, because I do know that he has usually exercised or been the recipient of a very great deal of support, especially in the cities. Given the current events, he's becoming more diplomatic and getting to exercise his foreign policy a little bit more. And then the earthquake and kind of his response to that is Assad still enjoying popular support of his people?
I truly believe that he has a solid support in Syria. Before the war, after the war, during the times of hostilities with the terrorist groups, I think his popularity among the people who were, let's say, secular, civilized, and people who want to see the best for Syria, it has increased. And this popularity has been boosted because they found him the savior from these terrorist groups. And everyone, every government does propaganda, right? Including the Syrian government. But the biggest supporter, I would say, or the biggest booster of Assad's popularity were these terrorist groups, because the actions they were doing when they occupy an area to the religious minorities, to the ethnic minorities, and even to the majority of the Sunnis, those who live under a Takfiri flag, for example, they were all persecuted. Lots of them were killed, like including sheikhs, imams, religious figures. If I'm talking about the Muslim community, they were assassinated by these terrorist groups. So even while the Western governments, they always see Syria from, I would say, from a lens dividing the country into ethnic and sectarian lines, which is an Orientalist, of course, lens. The truth is, the biggest support for the government or for Assad came from the Sunni community. And we're talking about the city of Damascus and the city of Aleppo. We're not talking about the suburbs, but we're talking about the cities. So these people form at least 9 million people. 9 million people of 24 million people. So put like on top of it, most of the minorities. So I truly believe that Assad's popularity at the beginning of the war was around 70%. This is just my subjective opinion. However, his popularity after 2018, although he has managed to crush most of the terrorist groups, started to diminish a little bit, and that is because of the sanctions. So when there were terrorist groups underground, you can see that there is that you have an enemy. You can see the enemy. You know what kind of warfare is this, and you know who's protecting you. But when there is no more hostilities and the enemy has become invisible and it is fighting you through economic means, you cannot really see what is fighting against you, who is fighting against you, what is the sanctions are doing to the people. And because of the high level of corruption in the Syrian government, and especially this has been skyrocketed after the war, and that is a very normal consequence of any war that leads into weakening the state institutions. In anywhere in the world when there is war and the state institutions become weaker, non-state actors, mafias will jump, non-state actors will become very influential in the economy of the country. And this is also not, the same case in Syria. So now we have lots of people in Syria that who can see that yes, the sanctions are harming us, but at the same time, how can the son of a minister, drive a Porsche in Damascus or in Latakia, and we cannot buy bread, right? And how can they have a fuel for the cars while we cannot fill a gas for our, let's say, factory or to warm our places? So the corruption is very high in Syria. And this has definitely damaged the popularity of Assad. How much popularity he has now? I think he has enough popularity to continue. And with or thanks to the diplomatic activity now in the region, trying to reopen and make a rapprochement with Assad again by these Arabic countries, if Saudi Arabia and Turkey open ties with Assad, which will happen sooner than later, it is soon, I think the entire conflict will change in Syria. If Turkey and Saudi Arabia challenge the American sanctions and say, no, we're going to deal with Syria, and it seems that this is the case because everyone in the region now see that the Americans are not the same that the US was 10 years ago. This will have a big impact on the reviving the Syrian economy. If the Syrian economy refunctions, you will see very fast reconstruction process in Syria because Syrians are very skilled. The Syrians are really, really, really productive people and really active people. And you will see a huge reconstruction in Syria in a very short time. But as I mentioned, this all depends on the regional countries challenging the US sanctions. If they follow the US sanctions, and if the US still dominates the international system, Syria will stay the same. And I'm very sad to say this because I see millions of people are suffering day to day, like just securing milk for their children, just securing a piece of bread for their kids, and the so-called civilized world, they don't give a damn about it. And for them, choking the Syrian people is just a strategy to urge them to revolt against Assad. Okay, we lost this war militarily, we lost the regime change war, but we have plan B. We will choke the people and we will tell them this is your government that you wanted to stick with. This is Assad that you supported him. Look, he cannot secure the basic necessities that you need. now the sentiments will be negative against the government, right? So this is what the Americans are trying to do in Syria. And I really think that the time is not playing in favor of Syria. And we have to accelerate the rapprochement with Turkey. And I'm saying this with a pain in my chest, because Turkey and Saudi Arabia played a huge destructive role in Syria. But it's just politics. It's interest. There is no permanent enemies and no permanent friendships, and we cannot deal with Saudi Arabia and Turkey as we deal with people on our personal relationships. So yes, unfortunately, we have to deal with Saudi Arabia and Turkey. We have to open ties with them. We have to open opportunities for investment from these countries in Syria. Otherwise, Syria will stay a big black hole that is digging and digging and digging deeper, and the people are slowly dying because of this. First, the regime change war, and then the sanctions imposed on them.
Uh,
Go ahead, JM.
no, you go ahead.
I was going to say on that note, I think we have run out of time, because we are at the hour. But I do want to ask you before we let you go, what can we do as outsiders for Syria and the Syrian people in order to best support them in their, because what I would love to see is, aside from my admiration for Bashar, I love the Levant and I love Palestine and Syria and Lebanon. How do we help and get them, bring them up with us into this world of multipolarity, because they deserve it? How do we best support Syrians right now on a world level?
Actually, the best thing we can do is truly continue speaking about the Syrian case, despite the importance of the Ukraine war. We have to keep repeating the impact of these illegal unilateral sanctions on the people. We have to relate them to previous examples, such as in Iraq, where 500,000 children died because of the American sanctions, in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Iran. We have to draw parallels between these sanctions. We have to keep speaking about it. And now the earthquake that hit Syria, it revived the discussion about the sanctions. And I realized that after 12 years of war, there are so many people who didn't know that there are sanctions imposed on Syria. So speaking, please, whoever is listening, if you know that there are sanctions on Syria, do not suppose that other people know. Unfortunately, we're living in a world where people are really busy with their daily lifestyle and life events. So they don't have the privilege, let's say, for the time to check and double check and research. So podcasts like yours, guys, and anyone who is active on social media accounts, they should talk about this, because there are over 20 million people stuck in an open air prison. They can't leave the country, they can't get visas, they can't buy the basic necessities for them. Secondly is financial help. It's very important for us to find alternatives to finance reconstruction in Syria, and I'm not sure how can we do that, but in countries like China and in Russia, we have to find platforms that do not follow the US sanction regimes, because most of the platforms available nowadays online are they're over compliant with these sanctions, and they're afraid that their platforms will be sanctioned by the US if they raise any sort of money for the Syrians. So humanitarian aid is very important, but most importantly is we have to find a platform where we can finance reconstruction. And we're talking about $200 billion here. It's a very huge number. And I'm not saying we can do it alone, but any penny, any dollar that can be funneled into Syria, it's a great help, because guys have to remember the average salaries now, due to the inflation and all this. So before the war, average salaries were $1,000, right, per person. And for $1,000, you could have had like an amazing life in Syria. But now it is $30, the average salaries. So you do the calculation, what can you buy for $30 in Syria? So if you can dedicate $10 per month for a crowdfunding platform to be funneled into Syria, that would be very great help. But the most important thing is the social pressure on the politicians, on the decision makers. In the United States, you have so-called exiled Syrian oppositionists. They are allied with the AIPAC, and they're able to impact on influence on the Congress, on the all the state institutions there in order to impose further sanctions on the Syrian people. So we have to have people active in the United States lobbying on the politicians there and showing them what the sanctions are doing for the Syrian people. Am I saying that they're humanitarians and they're going to be sad if they see what the sanctions are doing? No. But when we corner them, and especially after the earthquake, we did, and we showed to the entire world how heartless and inhuman are the decision makers in the United States for imposing these sanctions. We've seen that they halt these sanctions for 6 months, which is not enough. So anytime the United States takes half a step back, we have to push them to take one step. When they take one step, we have to push them to take 2 steps. We never should stop in this to add pressure on the American empire, and hopefully they would also lose grip over Ukraine. This is another hopeful or wishful thinking of mine, and we would find some balance for international system and for us also to recover.
Kevork, thank you so much for coming on and answering our questions. It's been a joy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shukran in Arabic.
Let us know, let our listeners know where they can find you.
Yes, actually, they can definitely find me on Twitter. I'm most active there in English, Kevork Almassian, or YouTube. I post regular videos on YouTube under Syriana Analysis. I post long commentaries and short analysis there. I do podcasts, I do interviews with people. So it would be really appreciated if they can follow me on YouTube.
Thank you again. And as always, Allah, Syria, and Bashar. It's been another episode of BD. You guys have been great as always. I can't thank you enough, Kevork, and we will absolutely have to have you back again. And we will